Welcome to the Polite Conversations podcast, where every episode is focused on civility, decorum, and good manners. And I'm your lovable, non-controversial host, Ina. If you know me, you know I definitely don't like to ruffle any feathers at all. Well, hello there, lovely listeners. I hope you all have your calipers ready because it's going to be a particularly skull-measury episode. We'll be talking about all sorts of present-day phrenology fans and skull measurers and the people and scenes adjacent to them. Such fun stuff. A big content warning over all of this, of course, because there will be a lot of intense racism and racists being discussed, as you probably got a taste of in the intro episode last time. So my panel for this episode consists of returning guest and scientist, Mr. Evo Psych Google. Many of you will know him from Twitter and our previous extremely fun, not suitable for work, Evo Psych episodes. We also had anthropologist Catherine Townsend and evolutionary biologist Kevin Bird. It was a wonderful, illuminating conversation, highly entertaining too. On this show, I laugh about these awful things because if I didn't, I'd cry or scream. And as funny and ridiculous as these characters we discussed sound, I want to stress, of course, that race science has been used to justify some of the most awful shit in human history. Slavery, segregation, bombing the Middle East, and of course, Nazis loved it too. So it's revival with the intellectual dark web or heterodox sphere, whatever they're calling themselves nowadays, Quillette, and now the techno-fascist right is a serious issue that I hope more people will pay attention to. Two of the panelists on this episode, Catherine and Kevin, recently published an article titled "Journals That Published Richard Lynn's Racist quote-unquote research articles should retract them" for Stat News. We discussed that in some detail on the panel, but before we begin, I wanted to make sure I shouted out all the authors of the piece: Dan Samarodnitsky, hope I'm saying that right, Jedediah Carlson, James Langford, John Phillips, and Rebecca Sear. And apologies for the occasional drilling sounds in the audio. That's just Mr. Evo Psych drilling some skulls or heads, I presume. He was really getting into the spirit of the episode. What can I say? Anyway, it was great fun despite the awful subject. I split this whole thing into 3 parts. First is the intro episode that was released just before this one, and then the panel itself is also a 2-parter. So make sure you catch all the parts for a full picture. All 3 parts will be up early on Patreon. So if you'd like to hear the whole thing now and support this tiny little show, which is entirely listener funded, please subscribe via patreon.com/nice mangoes. Doing that will immediately increase your head circumference and IQ. You can also leave an Apple Podcast or Spotify review or subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make skull measurers everywhere mad as fuck. And now, the episode.
People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes. And then you're talking about what he calls racialist science or race science. And you are one of these toxic people who is guilty of even paying attention to this stuff.
Atheists, should be all over the race and IQ stuff because that's science as far as we know it at the moment.
People run screaming from the room if you talk about black and white differences in IQ.
Junk science. Junk science. Junk science. And for anyone paying attention, I think it should be obvious with a modicum of charity extended to us, that Murray and I are not racist, and that what we were saying was not coming from a place of racial animus.
I mean, if we took the brain of a 25-year-old black man and the brain of a 25-year-old white man, what is it that they're doing that...
Different sizes.
Yeah.
Average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Junk science. Junk science.
Blacks make less money than Ashkenazi Jews. But if you normalize by IQ, they don't.
But distorting and cherry-picking the science and slandering anyone who won't succumb to your level of confirmation bias as a racist is totally unethical. That's not good faith criticism. That's not good faith criticism. Again, those of you who think that this might be a matter of me being thin-skinned and intolerant of criticism have lost the plot. What is being attempted here is a wholesale destruction of my reputation. At minimum, people are trying to make me the next Charles Murray. And everyone who has ever hated something I've said and sought to vilify me is now piling on here. Junk science.
Different IQs, and we haven't even talked about male-female, which again is a whole other challenge to sort of absorb and understand.
Because it's simply a fact that defending the claims that Murray made sounds racist to many, many people. And it sounds, above all, that one cares about racial differences, which I don't.
The bell curve is the famous bell-shaped curve.
Junk science.
The bell curve is the famous bell-shaped curve.
Race science. Race science. Average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Race science. Race science. Race science. Race science.
Welcome everyone to episode 82. I thought today we'd do a nice light topic, race science. Just kidding. We never do light topics on this podcast. Today I've got an excellent panel here to discuss the topic. I have Kevin Bird, evolutionary biologist, Catherine Townsend, anthropologist, and returning guest, Mr. Evo Psych Google, who is an influencer, a science influencer of sorts, some sort of science guy.
Evolutionary psychologist, of course.
Let's be real. You're not an evolutionary psychologist, right? We don't want to confuse the audience. He is, as far as I know, not an evolutionary psychologist, but he does like to talk about them a lot. And if you heard our previous two-part episode, you will have heard plenty of fun chat about Evo Psych and the extremely rigorous subject that it is. And if you haven't heard it, I'll link it in the show notes. You guys can check it out. But welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for this nice, lighthearted topic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi, Kevin.
Hello.
All right. So you guys, Kevin and Catherine, wrote an article recently that was on the topic of race science, and Mr. Evo's site, Google just likes measuring skulls, as we established. So,
Yeah, I'm here to provide like a counter, argument to the. I'm going to debate it.
Oh God,
it's going to be a debate podcast.
I was not prepared for this. But yeah, so tell me more, Kevin and Catherine. What made you guys write on this topic?
Well, we have been kind of following this topic for a while, and there's been one person in particular, Richard Lynn, who's now deceased, who was a particularly popular science psychologist who produced lots and lots of different articles, and who has been very widely cited in the scientific literature and is still being cited in a lot of like more mainstream scientific articles. Sometimes I think by people who aren't really aware of his background, but he was basically responsible for producing something called a national IQ data set, which was really an attempt to kind of prove that people in different parts of the planet have average IQs that are innately different from one another.
Right.
So you can see how it bleeds into the race science thing.
Yeah, and I was reading your article, which is excellent, by the way, and I mean, that data seems like it's just massively flawed, and just, I'm no scientist nor an academic, but like, it was shocking to see that something like that can survive all these years and not like officially be retracted till now.
Right. And it's not as if it hasn't been without critiques. There have been critiques in scientific publications that have really like pulled it to pieces already, and yet it's still kind of, it's like the zombie science, race science is zombie science, that it just keeps on going. And I think that's because, these things haven't been retracted when they should have been. So our argument was really that some articles by Lynn that clearly need to be retracted, and given his background as somebody who was a white supremacist as well, they should be retracted, as well as, there should be some kind of investigation into articles that are really relying on this data set to make their arguments.
And you're not kidding, like, when you say white supremacist, like, just a quick Google of him, and, like, it says that he's a self-described scientific racist?
Yeah, that's right. And he was very vocal about his support for eugenics as well. He really believed that certain races were genetically inferior to other races, and that the white race should be kept pure.
Yikes.
Yeah, I mean, his conduct really, unfortunately, helped us with the article. I mean, we got to open up the thing with this vignette of him getting a sword at a ceremonial dinner for all his work in like eugenics and psychometrics and IQ research. Like unabashed about.
Yeah, well, I didn't quite understand that part in the article. Like, they gave him horns? Like, what? Can you explain that to me?
So it's part of his memoir, but he was presented with like this sword, and I'm guessing like some sort of like cattle horn or something as some like ceremonial or something to put on his wall to remember his lifetime achievements in eugenics.
Oh, okay. So when I read a pair of horns in the article, I'm like, I don't know. My mind just went to like some sort of like devil horns or something. I was really confused.
Well, it is this tradition in the UK, which dates back to like medieval times, I think, to give people who were cuckolded horns. So, and he mentions that, but I don't really know why they gave him the
people
horns.
People who were what?
But even Richard Lynn, he didn't know why they gave him the horns. He's like, I don't know why you gave me these horns. And then he launches into like some screed about like the decay of European civilization.
It's so bizarre because I'm just trying to picture like this ceremony, like honoring this race scientist, and then they give him a sword and then like a pair of horns, and even he's confused, and it just seems really strange.
It does feel like something out of like a Kubrick movie.
Yeah.
Just weird secret society
exactly.
stuff. But he's like he's gloating about it. He's like, yeah, these people love me.
Yeah, you did write that you guys did write that that he was perplexed at why he was bestowed with these honors. But yeah, it was a weird thing to read. And what do you mean, like, presented to cuckolds? I wasn't sure that's the word that you just said, Catherine, but
yeah,
that is what you said.
That is what I said. That is the thing. And I really don't understand it either. I was like, huh?
Okay.
But yeah,
this is getting.
Apparently, that's what they did. It could have been a private joke. I really don't know.
So, okay. So we're not talking about something sexual, or are we? Or we don't know.
We don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's lost to history.
I see.
Who knows?
So where did you guys find that bit about the cuckolds? Like what did it say about it? Like, just to give more context to the audience, because right now it's just like a weird situation. This race science guy is being honored with a sword and a pair of horns, and then the word cuckolds comes up.
So it was in his memoir, which was written not that long ago. I don't know. Kevin, can you remember?
Oh, I have the quote. Do you want me to read it?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. So you write in the article that Lynn wrote in his memoir why they had given me the horns, which are traditionally presented to cuckolds in England. I then spoke. I'm sorry. This is such a weird quote.
It's very weird.
I then spoke on the. Oh my God. I then spoke on the decay of European civilization resulting from the immigration of non-European peoples. Okay, so we're straight into it. Yeah, okay, so he was given the horns. He said something about it being a tradition, about them being presented to cuckolds, and then, as you said, Mr. Evo Psych, that he did indeed launch into some racist bullshit about European people. And, yeah, quite a beginning.
I think what's like, baffling about this kind of bit from his memoir is like that the people that were like celebrating Richard Lynn's life and career, they're all like IQ researchers, like proper, I suppose, in quotes, proper academics who were publishing. I think this is all part of like some celebration in the journal Personality and Individual Differences, which is in an Elsevier journal, and they had like they had dedicated an entire issue to Richard Lynn's life and contributions, as if he was like, some kind of like big actor, getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. And, reading like that issue is like crazy, like just all these people like with glowing reviews of like, oh, he did all this work, making up all this data, basically.
Yeah, I'm sure
and
it was
these
hard.
are, meant to be serious academics. Of course, like, I think I have a very low opinion of the IQ research field in general, because it's quite, it's clearly very adjacent to just straight up race science. And, as Kevin and Catherine kind of write in the article, the actual data of Richard Lynn's work is basically kind of just fabricated. It's all just pulled, like, hodgepodge, cherry-picked, very biased, and makes no sense, like, if you actually read the original source articles that he's, like, citing from. And the whole thing is kind of just this big work of just, like, fraud.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's take a step back for a second and just talk about what exactly is race science.
Who wants to go first?
Kevin?
Yeah, I'll take that. So there's a definition in a paper I co-authored a little bit ago that I think is just really encapsulates it well. So scientific racism is the use of scientific concepts and data to create and justify enduring biologically based racial hierarchy. I think I really like just how clearly it encapsulates kind of all the different aspects of it, sort of like weaponizing science, but with like the ultimate thing being this political goal of justifying anti-black racism or anti-immigrant sentiment, or based off the idea that these people are, inherently inferior due to their biology.
Right.
Yeah. A great summary. Yeah, I think it's important to note that, like, race science, it should be, like, the science part in, scare quotes, because, it looks like science. It kind of wants to be science, but when you, dig deeper, you see that it's all kind of just, a big fabrication that has, the facade of what looks like science, but it's all not very rigorous at all, as all for the purpose of, like, furthering the political far-right ideologies of, racism and anti-immigration. So yeah, I think it's important to just recognize that it is not science.
Yeah. And I think it's another thing about it is that it actually, like, dates back to the 18th century, really, and it started off as being a kind of a science that was used to justify slavery and so on. And then it was really with the advent of Darwinism that it kind of changed into something that was more about hereditarianism, which was more about biology, which was more about thinking about different races as different evolutionary lineages. But the themes have kind of, like, been the same, which is about trying to establish a hierarchy of different races, with, the white race being the superior race and other races being somehow deficient in one respect or another since that time.
Now, unfortunately for Murray, what we have here is a set of nested taboos. Human intelligence itself is a taboo topic. People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life. And not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Now, for better or worse, these are all facts. In fact, there is almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims. About IQ, about the validity of testing for it, about its importance in the real world, about its heritability, and about its differential expression in different populations. Again, this is what a dispassionate look at decades of research suggests. Unfortunately, the controversy over the bell curve did not result from legitimate, good faith criticisms of its major claims. Rather, it was the product of a politically correct moral panic that totally engulfed Murray's career and has yet to release him. His co-author, Richard Lynn, died just before the book was published. So Murray weathered the storm alone, and it rages to this day.
So it's a really ideological, that was how it was birthed, and that's how it has continued right up until this very day, is that it's highly ideological, and it's motivated by this idea that there ought to be a hierarchy of different kinds of human beings with white people at the top.
Right. I was going to say that, it seems like we still hear the echoes of that, like more obvious and blatant race science. We're still dealing with that today. Like, we all are familiar with the intellectual dark web and some of those people. And it's especially funny that you guys say, like, it's ideological and it's posing as science, because one thing that those guys always stress is just like how completely free of biases they are, and how like objective and rational they are, and how everybody else is ideological or quote unquote tribal.
You don't realize when you keep saying that everybody else is thinking tribally but you're not, that is our disagreement.
Well, no, because I know I'm not thinking tribally in this respect.
Well, that is our disagreement. I think that your core identity in this is as someone who feels you get treated unfairly by politically correct mobs, and
but that's you're playing. That is not identity politics. That is my experience as a public intellectual trying to talk about ideas.
That I will say this. That is what folks from the dominant group get to do. They get to say, my thing isn't identity politics, only yours is. I will tell you, Sam, when people who do not look like you hear you telling them that this is just identity politics, they don't think, God, he's right. That is just identity politics. They think this is my experience and you don't understand it.
But these guys are just looking at the facts, and the facts just happen to lead them to race science and race and IQ and things like that.
Yeah.
Does that sound accurate?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
100%.
But the problem is that the data on population differences will continue to emerge whether we're looking for it or not. And the idea that one should lie about these data or pretend to be convinced by bad arguments that are politically correct, or worse, that it's okay to malign people or even destroy their reputations if they won't pretend to be convinced by bad arguments, that's a disaster. Morally and politically and intellectually, that is a disaster, and that's where we are.
There's I was so happy it was published. I was so happy that we stumbled upon it before writing the article. There was like some recent archival work looking at the correspondence of like Richard Lynn, co-author of Charles Murray for The Bell Curve, which I think like represents this sort of like in the last 30 years, like the like a milestone almost of like scientific racism and sort of like a peak of some of its influence. And a lot of this correspondence is them being like, we really want to push this idea, these like eugenical and sort of like scientific racist ideas into the mainstream, get the media talking about it, get think tanks talking about it, get politicians talking about it. And for as much like bluster as like Charles Murray and his defenders have put forth of him being this, ideologically unbiased, just the facts, ma'am, science guy.
Yeah.
These letters reveal a completely different story. Like there's all of this planning and kind of conniving and even working with Richard Lynn to guide the writing of some of these chapters. It shows how hollow, how absolutely false this narrative they tried to spin about their bias and their objectivity really is.
So Murray's co-author was like openly writing and collaborating with Richard Lynn, the self-identifying race scientist?
Oh yeah. I mean, as was Charles Murray himself.
I think it was the correspondence was Richard Herrnstein's in Harvard, but it would include letters or emails maybe at that point to Murray, to Lynn, and it was pieced together by might as well shout out the historian here, Quinn Slobodian, was the one who wrote the academic article, which we kind of picked the highlights of for our press article.
I mean, for anyone paying attention, I think it should be obvious, with a modicum of charity extended to us, that Murray and I are not racist, and that what we were saying was not coming from a place of racial animus.
I mean, another thing to say about that actually is that another way of trying to sort of make it seem as if they were just being objective. So Charles Murray and Herrnstein Herrnstein had actually died by the time that the bell curve made a big splash. But Charles Murray kept on insisting that, in fact, race was just a very small part of the bell curve.
Yeah.
And, really they were just looking at differences in class IQ, and that his mind wasn't made up about what the differences in racial IQ were due to. So he kept on insisting that he didn't have a hereditary explanation for that in mind, that he was agnostic about that, when in actual fact, if you go back to some of the things that he had authored that predate him making those kinds of statements, he had very much, depending on the audience that he was reaching out to, he very much pushed the idea that there was this kind of hereditary difference in racial IQs. So they're always trying to kind of present themselves as being, agnostic and objective, and, they're just following the facts. But all along, it was motivated by this desire to show that there were racial differences in IQ and that those differences were biological or genetic in nature.
Yeah, so that the historian that Kevin mentioned, Quinn Slobodian, I think that's how you pronounce it. So yeah, he also wrote a great article in The Baffler called The White Man Unburdened, which is about Charles Murray and Richard Lynn, and it really goes into detail about how the Pioneer Fund, which was Richard Lynn was a part of, among many other race scientists, they were really invested in Charles Murray and them writing this book, The Bell Curve, and they were even pitching the idea we could help fund the book a bit if the American Enterprise Institute doesn't come through or something.
The bell curve. Fund the bell curve.
The bell curve, yeah. But yeah, the Pioneer Fund gang, which included Richard Lynn, and they were all, they were, in there with the trenches, with, Charles Murray, helping him, I guess, kind of lead him through the, twisted garden of race science, and Charles Murray, and he heavily cites Richard Lynn in the bell curve, and including I think his very first national IQ paper, which is in Mankind Quarterly,
which is also a racist.
Oh yes, of course.
Journal.
Yes, definitely.
Openly so. Right?
Oh yeah, and funded by the Pioneer Fund.
Okay, so so the Pioneer Fund. So just to simplify it, is what exactly?
It's like a research fund that was established in the 1930s sometime by Nazi sympathizers, and it was funded by an American multimillionaire by the name of Wycliffe Preston Draper.
Yeah.
And he was a Nazi sympathizer. The first head of the fund was a Nazi sympathizer as well, who wanted to send African Americans to Africa. And so the first president wanted to. He actually wrote legislation that informed the US policy for sterilization of people on a eugenic basis.
Wow.
And which also influenced the Nazis. So, yeah, it has a very long history of very, very racist and very, very eugenic activities.
Mm.
Yeah, you kind of like any stone you turn over related to scientific racism almost inevitably connects back to the Pioneer Fund in one way or another.
Yeah.
Through like the 40s and 60s, most of the activity was sort of around opposing desegregation, and then later on there was this seeming kind of change in focus to where it started funding scientific researchers and distributing their research. And so Richard Lynn being one of the most prominent, J.P. Rushton, and Arthur Jensen, probably like the three titans of late 20th century race science, kind of all being propped up by millions of dollars to the Pioneer Fund.
Yeah.
Wow. And how then does like a book like The Bell Curve just like make it so mainstream and have so-called rational mainstream public figures promoting it like it's normal when it has these clear ties to things as blatantly racist as the Pioneer Fund? Like, I think Sam Harris said something like, Charles Murray is one of the most unfairly maligned people of my life, or in my lifetime, something like that.
Yeah, that's funny.
I hadn't paid attention to Murray, and so when I did read the book and did some more research on him, I came to think that he was probably the most unfairly maligned person in my lifetime. It doesn't really run the risk of being much of an exaggeration there. And the most controversial passages in the book struck me as utterly mainstream with respect to the science at this point. They were mainstream at the time he wrote them, and they're even more mainstream today.
Yes, Sam Harris is a racist moron as well. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Sam Harris, of course, had Murray on his podcast in 2017 at the time that Murray was doing a round of campus tours, doing talks, and there was resistance to these talks by students and by faculty and so on. And so Sam Harris decided, for some reason, which only he knows, to champion Murray.
I think we know.
It's such a mystery. Yeah.
Yeah. And, he basically agreed with Murray and kind of just took everything Murray had said as basically, like settled science.
Yeah. Yep. And he said
as if there was as if there was no scientific controversy at all. Like he just presented that Harris presented that to his audience as if this was all, like this is just normal science, not controversial at all.
I find the dishonesty and hypocrisy and moral cowardice of Murray's critics shocking. And the fact that I was taken in by this defamation of him. So it is with real pleasure and some trepidation that I bring you a very controversial conversation on points about which there is virtually no scientific controversy. And it's with a man who could not have been a more genial and well-spoken guest. Meet Charles Murray.
And anybody who is, protesting or critiquing this is just a bad faith actor, basically.
Yeah, just like angry, woke mobs.
Right, yeah, exactly. So he picked a side.
Distorting and cherry-picking the science and slandering anyone who won't succumb to your level of confirmation bias as a racist is totally unethical. That's not good faith criticism. This is one side of a scientific debate smearing the other side with the most toxic moral and intellectual aspersions possible. These are reputation-destroying slanders.
Actually, I didn't know who Sam Harris was before. Or I kind of knew he was this sort of person, like this atheist person who had, who was very opinionated, but I only really started paying attention to him at that time, actually. So he made a splash.
Yeah,
Sam Harris did by supporting Charles Murray, and I think he got really angry at the reaction as well, because I know he was like really angry that the Southern Poverty Law Center had had created a page about him.
Yep, because basically he sees himself in these situations, right? Like, because he's been criticized for his racist views for so long. So he sympathizes when other people are like criticized and canceled on campuses, and he continues to claim that he's completely non-ideological, just objectively looking at the facts. And then it's so obvious that he's relating this sort of cancellation to his own experiences, but he'll never admit it. He says things like, "What's my tribe?" I'm not tribal. I'm, and he said things as awful as, I'm of Jewish background, and I put at least part of the blame of the Holocaust on Jews. Like, he says that they brought it upon themselves. And he says this in an effort to say, like, see how non-tribal I am? And it's like, dude, no, that's not
right. Yeah.
I have written that the Jews are in part responsible for the Holocaust. How tribal is that? Now that's part of my denigration of belief of faith-based religions. Like, if the Jews defining themselves as Jews for 2,000 years, insisting upon living insular lives among communities that believe antithetical things about God, and thinking that it's important to marry within their community because of the profundity of their religious beliefs and their unique covenant with God. All of that divisive bullshit is part of the backdrop that gave us the centuries of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So yeah, I'm someone who has said, who's made Judaism itself somewhat culpable in giving us the Holocaust. Now what am I, a neo-Nazi? What's my tribe?
It takes a lot of bravery and a lot of non-tribalness to 2004 write a hypothetical about glassing the Middle East with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, totally. He'll write things like in defense of torture, and then when like some fascist gets milkshake thrown on his face, he calls that like a mock assassination.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can't take that guy seriously. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But it paints the whole situation, which is as much of a fuss as Harris makes about all this. There's no one further from being scientifically qualified to assess like any of this stuff than Harris or Murray or really any of them. And, there's a notable lack of biologists, geneticists, evolutionary biologists behind any of this work, and everybody who's loudly critical of it has that kind of expertise.
Right. I mean, they have their biologist, their evolutionary biologist, Jerry Coyne.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, they have for the IDW stuff, but at least so far, the future may change. Coyne hasn't jumped full race science yet. But the ideological lines, has he gotten worse?
He has said things like that universities suffer when there's more diversity or something. I can't remember the exact word for word quote.
I mean, I think he's just racist.
He truly is. I mean,
he might not be like, I hope he's not, the full race science, like in terms of, thinking in terms of the evolutionary, like the biology terms of like,
yeah.
So what
I recall, I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, E.O. Wilson, who was...
that's what I was going to bring up.
Right, the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, it emerged that he had a long correspondence with another one of the big three, which is Philippe Rushton. and that he was entirely sympathetic, actually, with the whole kind of scientific racism thing. And Jerry Coyne claimed at the time to, I think I'm remembering this correctly, that he claimed to not know he hadn't known who Rushton was.
Oh, okay.
So, like, he leapt to E.O. Wilson's defense and was like, no, this is, of course, this is just a political attack on E.O. Wilson, who, the left have been out to get for ages. And, I don't know who this Rushton bloke is, but, I'm sure E.O. Wilson didn't do anything bad. So, he claimed not to know who Rushton was. I don't know if that's, I don't know how seriously I can take that. I don't know how you can be an evolutionary biologist and have never heard of that side of, how evolutionary biology is represented by racists. But it does seem like he's at least sort of distanced himself in some ways.
Okay, well, that's a pretty typical IDW move too, to defend something, and then when you're called out on it, be like, "Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know who I was promoting. I didn't know who I was hanging out with. I didn't know." Yeah, that's pretty classic. So
the other thing is guilt by association, isn't it?
Oh yeah, that's
right. Yeah,
that's their move as well.
Bad faith.
There's just so much evidence of bad faith on his side. As my friend Brett Weinstein says, bad faith changes everything. And it really does.
Another fan of E.O. Wilson is Steven Pinker, whom I just have put out a couple of episodes on. And I was reading an article about him in the Harvard Crimson, and I'm just going to read you a couple quotes from that. In 2006, Pinker published a favorable review of a scientific paper which argued that Ashkenazi Jews may have evolved to have higher IQs than other racial and ethnic groups. One of the first academics to be canceled, Pinker says, was E.O. Wilson. Wilson was a biologist and professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard. Today, he is known for two things: his award-winning work on biodiversity and his public branding as a racist. In 1975, Wilson published a book called Sociobiology, The New Synthesis, which argues that behaviors result from genes, very much in the strain of work that I wrote about on human nature, Pinker says. And he stepped into a debate about scientific racism. In his book, Wilson writes that there should be a discipline of anthropological genetics to explore whether cultural differences are biological.
I mean, Pinker has a history of being in association with race scientists, also known as human biodiversity.
Yep.
Researchers,
researchers, whatever, including Steve Saylor.
Does Pinker have an open association with him?
No, well, not anymore, but he did publish one of Steve Saylor's articles back in 2006 or something like that, at the time, about the time of the Iraq War, which was about cousin marriage, which was basically this kind of screed about how you couldn't impose democracy on these primitive people. Basically, I don't know if he really said that, but it intimated that due to cousin marriage, it would be very difficult for people to accept democracy.
Okay.
And that's the piece that Pinker published, and I believe that he's also been in a chat group or something that Saylor started up.
It was the human biodiversity email group.
Oh, and right. How did everyone find out about that?
I think the list got leaked out because they added a lot of people. I mean, they added Jonathan Marks, who's an anthropologist who's highly critical of human biodiversity, and kind of several others.
Oh.
But I I don't know the facts of like how much Pinker engaged with it, but to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if that that Ashkenazi Jewish IQ paper you mentioned was something that he came across from that email group. Another case of like shockingly bad hereditary and race science research, and one that Pinker I think still defends and holds as like an eminently reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, because when this is a few years ago now, but what's that op-ed writer in the New York Times who wrote about like Jewish IQ and why Jews are so smart?
Brett,
was that
what's his name? Brett Stevenson or something.
Brett
the guy
Stevens.
the guy
I don't even
that was
remember.
called the bedbug.
Yeah, I
That's
think
right.
it's Brett Stevens.
So yeah, Brett Stevens cited that very old, stupid race science article about Ashkenazi Jewish IQ. People call that out and be like, "This is like you're citing like straight up race science from like to at least one white supremacist."
Yeah, and I mean, how do people not realize that this is the kind of stuff that's used like by anti-Semitic extremists all the time?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's a bizarre rhetorical play, which is, and I think Jordan Peterson has done it. Nathan Kaufness, who is a philosophy postdoc, who's also
Jewish,
like intimately, who's Jewish and intimately tied to kind of alt-right scientific racist people. But their argument is this defeats anti-Semitism because Jewish people aren't conspiratorial and conniving. They're just smarter than you, and that's why they dominate like the media and business and academia.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And that is like straight up. I mean, Nathan Kaufman was publishing a back and forth scholarly article debate with Kevin McDonald, like the most notorious academic anti-Semite. Where he's trying to hold this position down of Jewish people aren't conspiratorial and undermining society. It's IQ that explains why they dominate.
Oh my gosh.
They're just smart and conniving because they have a higher genetic IQ.
Yeah, and I think like what people don't realize is that was very much like a Nazi kind of conception of why Jewish people were not, like acceptable to the German racially pure Aryan kind of race was because of this, they were like the diseased Jew, like part of it was this kind of conniving intelligence.
Right.
So, and even Richard Lynn, he has a whole book about, it's called The Chosen People, which is, about Jewish intelligence.
Oh boy.
It's the kind of like race science of Jews, and it has that plausible deniability that we're just we're lauding Jewish people, we're admiring them, but actually it's pretty. It's got this anti-Semitic undercurrent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
but that's the kind of thing that could just emerge from, the study of hoarding behavior. If someone studies the psychological problem of hoarding and they study the genetics of it, and then they just happen to discover that the genetics are represented differently in different populations, and Ashkenazi Jews, of which, half of my ancestry is, have more of the hoarding genes than other people. Do we deal with that like adults? Or do we vilify the person who merely spoke about the data? That's the bright line I'm trying to get you to acknowledge.
Yeah, the human biodiversity people have also ruined the concept of saying HBD for happy birthday.
Wasn't Claire Lehman known to be one of these HBD people online before, and then she scrubbed all mentions of it?
She was definitely a big platformer of it with the Quillette. It's hard to say in her heart of hearts if she, actually believed in the race science, because I think she's just, my personal opinion, she was just very cynical just like a careerist trying to make like this name for herself by platforming.
I mean, she worked for a Canadian far-right organization, Rebel Media, too, so she seems to be drawn to, like, specifically racist stuff.
I mean, I think she had some kind of background in psychology as a psychology student or something at one point, and I think she maybe just really bought into the whole IQ, like, and the racial hereditarian IQ sort of side of things, and just thought, like, being a pretty conservative-minded individual, she maybe just really thought like she was like Sam Harris and was just kind of like bought into it hook, line, and sinker, and really thought, well, this is legitimate science.
I think there's like the excitement of following something that's taboo, so to speak.
Right.
And you're like, it's taboo because like it's telling the truth, and it's people can't handle that.
Yeah. I'm one of the few people who are rational enough to handle this difficult truth that just happens to confirm all my biases.
So you see, like, Quillette has platformed a lot of basically race science essays. By various race scientists. And basically, I mean, it's funny with Claire Lehman because you don't like think about her anymore because she built this career kind of like pandering to the far right crowd, like by feeding them like these race science essays from Quillette. And then when all of a sudden she kind of takes the rational stance that vaccines actually work. This audience that she built up like turned on her, and it's like, well, this is what you get.
That was a really strange time during the height of the pandemic when the like phrenology crew and the anti-vax crew were like fighting. And they used to be like one big crew before, but then they split, and it was amusing.
Watching the realignment, Brett Weinstein gets all of them in the divorce because he bought into the anti-vaccine quackery.
Well, even some of the people who were like, pretty good on vaccines initially, like Sam Harris, like, he's been kind of like backtracking a bit and hanging with Bill Maher and saying that it was a bad idea to like mask kids at all, and that like he would never get another booster, and like,
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So people always like to say, well, he's one of the good ones of the IDW. At least he's been so good on like vaccines, but no, not really.
It is, I think, not to sympathize with any of them, but like if you're in their position and you've built this fan base, and you build your fan base on kind of like, say, spouting Islamophobia, or even like, promoting the bell curve in Sam Harris's case, that kind of, those beliefs kind of correlate with other beliefs in your audience.
Right.
And so, there is kind of like this feedback loop with you and your audience where you kind of have to kind of hold a party line almost.
Right.
And I think even Sam Harris, even as rational as he is not immune to these biases.
To tribalism?
To tribalism, yeah.
Well, I hate that word tribalism. I think it's totally misused, but that's the subject of a different podcast.
That's an anthropology episode, maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many of these like more mainstream figures that have been like bringing this stuff back and popularizing it, like Elon Musk, for example.
Well, yes. I was about to say Elon is the big one. He's kind of like, I guess, the main, I think, promoter of contemporary, race science today. That he's just, he's changed X so much.
Yeah.
Replying wow to every like race and crime stat account. And, We never checked to see if he ever engaged with any of the national IQ maps, but there's a non-zero chance.
Right.
Yeah. And he's also like involved in this like pro-natalist movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that kind of ties back in with eugenics.
Yeah.
You know, so kind of like peas in a pod there.
Yeah, and then like Silicon Valley, like very involved in this kind of stuff, like tech fascism is on the rise, and these extremely powerful billionaires are funding just awful things. And
Yeah. I mean, we don't know who is behind funding the current crop of the younger race science people, because there are some very young people involved now. And the Pioneer Fund, we know, has pretty much run out of money. They don't have a lot left. They've got a little bit of money left. But there's probably some dark money that is funding some of the younger individuals at this point, and we don't know exactly who's behind that.
There's bits and pieces coming out, but people found out about the Pioneer Fund because as a nonprofit, all their tax records were publicly accessible. And some of the biggest stories came out from a psychologist and kind of historian combing through that. Now it's a little bit less clear, but some of the potential trails are, like Richard Hanania's funding sources were revealed as kind of one of the known names in like conservative dark money. I can't quite. I think Jonathan Katz is the journalist who wrote about that, right?
I think
yes,
so.
he is, but I didn't know that the funding source had come out. I mean, Richard Hanania is a racist and was definitely a Nazi, but I don't think he's really on top of the kind of race science sort of strain of all of that, is he?
Oh, I think he's pretty horrendous.
He's heavily adjacent, and his fake think tank, which I'm sure where a lot of money gets funneled into, had scientific racist adjacent people on it also. I think one was Jordan Lasker, some random PhD student who wrote with the race science crowd and tried to use genetics to show that the more European ancestry you have, the smarter you are, the higher your IQ scores.
Right.
So like Hanania's embedded within it for sure.
He's said some horrendous things before, and I mean, the funny part is that, like, it came out that, was he the one that it was exposed that he was writing for white nationalist websites, like, under a pseudonym, and everyone was confused because, like, he writes pretty racist stuff, like, under his real name. And
Yes. Absolutely. So, yeah, that's the guy. I think, yes, he has endorsed sort of hereditarian and race science views, but he hasn't actually produced any himself, whereas someone like Jordan Lasker is actually, like, producing these articles to try and get into scientific venues.
Yeah.
Here, I have some quotes from an article about Richard Hanania. So this article is from The Nation. In 2011, he argued for a law that forcibly sterilized everybody with an IQ under 90. In 2010, he wrote that Hispanics don't have the requisite IQ to be a productive part of a first world nation. So, yeah. Pretty awful.
It is interesting, like, why are these Silicon Valley people, funding this this stuff? And I mean, just on Twitter in general, like, it seems like a lot of Silicon Valley people are just really into race science.
They're all in on it. The rationalist sub community, which is probably compared to some of the Silicon Valley ones, is not even the most extreme. Scott Siskind was, like, all in on race science stuff, and it was all free game, and, like, the bell curve and all these Pioneer Fund folks were, like the Sam Harris draft, these people who don't really know what they're looking at are obsessed with this idea about being objective and neutral and scientifically rational, read a bunch of racist bullshit that kind of aligns with their preconceptions and just go all in for it.
Can you talk about some of the ways in which Lynn's data is flawed, and just like how deeply flawed it is at such like critical and basic levels?
Yeah. Tough to know where to start. I think one of them is in some of the academic reviews of Lynn's work, people who tried to replicate failed to replicate. One of the things that they found was that the only feature of an article consistently associated with Lynn including it in his analyses was that it showed a low IQ for Africa. There's no published criteria or methodology for choosing articles to take in and to consider and those to exclude. But if you look at all the factors about them, the only one that showed any relationship to Lynn including it was that it just showed Africa had a low IQ. In like the individual samples, there's unrepresentative samples, samples that aren't even from the country, they're from immigrants in another country, samples of people who are, I think one of the ones from the article is, the only thing that we know about the sample is that they didn't have malaria. And even up to larger scale issues of, it's very likely, in fact, there's no evidence for it, a lot of reasons to believe that when you aggregate IQ scores at the national level, you're not measuring cognitive capacity. Even if you accept it on the individual level, IQ is measuring cognitive capacity. Accumulating it across an entire country is like doesn't match even the rigorous psychometrics that they try to include for IQ. And so it's not even clear that these IQ scores matter for intelligence at all, even if we take everything at face value.
Right, and his samples were so small too, right? Like,
they were small, they were biased, and one of the ways that he boosted his numbers was if he didn't have data for a country, he just took the average of the countries around it and then had that be the value. And so when you cook in all these other biases with the sort of clearly unsystematic sampling of studies, and then you start taking the average of all those, you're introducing an even bigger effect. And so one sanity check, every person who tries to defend this data set says, well, if you look at the international education assessment exams, they correlate fairly well. And then you take the data and you plot it against each other, and all of the national IQs are wildly discordant with what you would expect it to be based off of the test scores. So like Africa doesn't follow, is less correlated. In fact, almost not correlated at all. The IQ is extremely low despite the educational scores varying quite a bit, being higher than what the national IQ scores would suggest.
And another thing is that, like, the IQ studies that, so Richard Lynn, I guess to back up, he basically, to compile this national IQ data set, he basically, in a way, cherry-picked different, smaller IQ studies from across, the world, but also from across, like, different times. And that kind of introduces another bias, because if you're, say, taking, an IQ study that was from, like, say, the 1960s in Africa, like, is that really representative of, people in Africa today?
right.
I don't think so. And, Richard Lynn, he supposedly corrected for these things by, adding, like, a couple of IQ points for, every so many years, and there's, like, that's the Flynn effect correction. Of course, like, that's not how the Flynn effect works. You can't sometimes countries, like, have a very large Flynn effect, like, as in the IQs have increased very rapidly,
So can you just explain for the audience what the Flynn effect is? Because if you don't hang around in this gross part of the internet, it can sound really confusing, because we've got Lynn and then we've got Flynn, and I shouldn't know this stuff. I shouldn't know it.
But you do.
I do, because I listen to a lot of awful things online, particularly Sam Harris. So,
That's right. Well, I'm kind of assuming that everyone knows what the Flynn effect is. Who doesn't know? But anyway, basically, the Flynn effect is the increase in IQ scores over generations. Like, for every few years, IQ scores have to be like renormed, because we find that people, say children, are getting better at tests, because the thing about IQ tests is that you can kind of, in a way, train for them. You kind of get better at certain tasks, like say rotating a 3D object. I think kids these days are pretty damn good at that after playing
Roblox.
Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and stuff. So in a way, you do have to like kind of an IQ score from, say, a few decades ago is not necessarily representative of what those same people's IQ would be today. Like if they were to take the test again, you have to correct for IQ scores over time, because they are increasing, and people believe that they're increasing for cultural reasons. So you have to renorm the IQ scores. Does that make sense?
So not because our brains are collectively getting bigger or something.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah, I think you have to back up a little bit and recognize that what IQ is testing to some extent is the extent to which someone has assimilated the kinds of skills that are valued in the Western education system. So a hunter-gatherer person has a completely different kind of intelligence that would not be captured by IQ.
Right, yeah.
And so they're not it's not a culture-free test. And that is the major problem with the whole conception of the idea of trying to compare different IQ scores of different nations, and then also trying to interpret those as being some kind of innate biological intelligence,
right,
that's represented by that one number that is produced by that IQ test. I mean, even the same person from the same cultural background will have different outcomes on IQ tests depending on different factors over the course of their lifetime. But if you take an IQ test to a community that is non-literate, as in they, reading and writing don't play a role in their culture, then they're not going to understand that test.
Mm-hmm.
And so Richard Lynn even tried to do this with hunter-gatherer people. He took cognitive tests and that had been done by other anthropologists for different purposes, and tried to, present these as if they were just IQ tests that were that represented the innate intelligence of these people. And it's clearly all just nonsense.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that if you look at some of those papers that Richard Lynn cites, and it's oh look, these African people are dumb, have low IQs. The actual papers themselves, the authors in those papers are saying we can't really take this IQ test as any indication of their actual intelligence, and they even go on to say stuff like these. When you explain the test better, they perform better, or there are certain things the people that we tested, they didn't understand the test for X, Y, and Z reasons, and because they just don't haven't encountered such a thing before, and they stress. I mean, many of these articles that Richard Lynn cites stress, shouldn't take this as any indication of, whatever their genetic intelligence.
Yeah. So what was it that you were saying about the Flynn effect? I'm sorry that I stopped you and kind of...
So basically, because the IQ studies that Richard Lynn was picking, they're all from different time points. So, some are from... the 90s. A lot of the African IQ studies are very old, which is quite suspicious already.
Right.
But of course, at this point in time, with IQ researchers understand that you can't compare IQ scores across time because of the Flynn effect. And So Richard Lynn, I guess his way around it was just like, we'll add like, a couple of points for every, whatever, 10 years or something. I don't remember his exact methodology, but it was all vibes based, basically. And of course, that's not rigorous. I'm sure IQ researchers can actually kind of measure the Flynn effect better than that.
That's actually one of the other problems. It's not, within a country across generations, conditions have changed that, brought about the Flynn effect. Something environmentally, about educational systems, about nutrition. And between countries, those things differ. So, in the criticism of Lynn, another point brought up is that it kind of seems like the Flynn effect hasn't taken place in Africa yet. And a lot of the variables or factors that seem to be associated with it in developed Western countries or in the US and the UK are like radically different in Africa. So not only are these they're these older studies, but comparing a score to Africa and the US is already confounded because they have different levels of economic development, and economic development affects IQ scores through the Flynn effect. Whereas, their interpretation, of course, is that economic development is almost exclusively caused by the cognitive ability of a country.
Yep.
And so Africa doesn't score low on IQ scores because it's a poor and underdeveloped continent.
Right, and they don't factor in the colonialism and the plundering and the looting at all.
Yeah, that never comes into a question of why is Africa underdeveloped. It's that, Africa is underdeveloped because their IQ scores are low. And of course, IQ scores can't be biased because
they're numbers. They're numbers.
Perfect objective science.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing when you read these Richard Lynn articles that's so striking is like he has these very explicit assumptions about what is going on under the hood with like IQ and genetics, where the IQ is purely something that is determined by your genetics, and the differences in IQ can only be because of your genetics.
Yeah.
Those differences are because of evolution in his opinion, which, I mean, when you of course, if you think about it, there's no evidence for that.
They love to deny and downplay environmental factors. And I remember when Ezra Klein had this debate with Sam Harris, and it was so funny because Sam was really arguing hard about how Ezra Klein is misrepresenting and wokeifying, I assume, what Flynn says. And so Ezra Klein says...
You mean Charles Murray says?
No, about Flynn. About Flynn.
About Flynn?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was saying, no, you're misrepresenting it in some way. I guess he doesn't... I don't remember the exact context, but Sam did not like the way that Ezra Klein was explaining the Flynn effect. And Ezra said something like, no, I literally just spoke to him 2 days ago. He had called Flynn and talked to him directly. And Sam didn't know this beforehand. So when Ezra Klein was explaining the Flynn effect, Sam was pushing back hard and saying that no, you're misleading about what Flynn says. And Ezra was like, no, I literally just spoke to him. So that was funny.
Interesting.
Your bias here, your connection to the political outcomes when you're talking about the empirical science, is causing you to make journalistic errors, is causing Nisbet and Turkheimer to make errors of scientific reasoning, and these are obvious errors. I mean, in your last piece, you have this whole section on the Flynn effect, and how the Flynn effect should be read as accounting for the black-white differences in purely environmental terms. Well, even Flynn rejects that interpretation of the Flynn effect. I mean, he had originally he publicly hoped that his effect would account for that, but now he has acknowledged that the data don't suggest that. And there are many other errors of this kind that you and Nisbet and Turkheimer are making when you criticize me and Murray. And you criticize Murray for errors that he didn't make.
I do want to note, you mentioned James Flynn here. To prepare for this conversation, I called Flynn the other day. I spoke to him on Monday. His read of the evidence right now, and this is me quoting him, he says, "I think it is more probable than not that the IQ difference between black and white Americans is environmental. As a social scientist, I cannot be sure if they have a genetic advantage or disadvantage." So that is what James Flynn thinks as of Monday.
Yeah.
That is kind of a common kind of a habit in, I think, the race science community, where, these the guys that are into race science, they kind of misread and misrepresent like genetics and evolutionary biology, where they think it's saying one thing when really is saying like quite the opposite. And it's always funny how they get that wrong.
I found this one quote from the article that Catherine and Kevin and others wrote, so striking. I'm just going to read it because it's mind-blowing, really, like how you can get data from this kind of flawed methodology and then continue to build on it, and like people still use it and cite it and legitimize it today. I'm no scientist and I'm no academic, so I understand I don't know these things as well as scientists do, but like this is just really striking. They're talking about Lynn, and it says, he calculated the national IQ of Angola, a nation of 35 million people, from tests performed on 19 individuals, about whom, as Kevin was just saying, almost the only thing known is that they did not have malaria. He calculated the IQ of the Dominican Republic from 34 individuals, Greenland from 40, Uzbekistan from 51, the Republic of Congo from 88 school children, Namibia from 103 school children, from an ethnic group which makes up only 7% of the national population, Sierra Leone from 119 individuals, all tested in 1966, like you were just saying. And Botswana, from 140 adolescents who don't even appear to have been citizens of Botswana. Like, it's mind-boggling.
Something else crazy happens, which is, like you just said, reading that, just a simple survey of just basic descriptions already should be like setting off alarms in your head that something's like clearly wrong. And at the same time, one thing that people bring up about these scores all the time is that if you take them at face value, if you say that Angola has a national IQ of like 67, that means that like the majority of people in that country meet part of or older clinical definitions of like mental handicap. And to me, obviously that kind of claim is like total bullshit. Obviously. And it should be like a red flag to anybody. And one, for some people it isn't. And then another really funny thing happens where these sort of like come up with epicycles, like these ad hoc things. And so one that I think is especially funny is that I think Arthur Jensen or maybe Richard Lynn also essentially said that an IQ of 67 is different for someone from Africa or from like a black person in the U.S. than a white person. Because 67 for a white person is 2 standard deviations below their mean, but it's not that far below the mean for the African or for the black person.
Wow.
And like which is also like in admission, like if you take that to be true, that means that IQ is also not measuring the same thing between these groups. If a score of 67 doesn't mean the same thing.
Exactly.
And so like every corner that you turn is full of these sort of like ad hoc rationalizations and these excuses and like burying your head from something that is like obviously total bullshit. It's really astonishing. It's one of the most frustrating things to engage with.
Yeah, it's like I think like the argument from Arthur Jensen and Lynn is like, well, like what you said. It's like, so is the implication that like just like say an IQ of 67 is basically an IQ of 100 for them? In which case it's like, well, so what's the point? Or is it that do
we have a cat near the mic?
No, that's my dog, like snoring. Yeah. Shut up. And then, like, was it that, like, their genetic, say, threshold, to put it in crude terms, for, like, mental impairment is, like, so much lower. It's like they believe that people of different racial groups are, like, you know, extraordinarily, like, different in terms of their biology, which really kind of tells you a lot about how they think.
Yeah, I think another part of their argument is that, you know, life is really simple in Africa. You have to understand, you know, it doesn't require anything like too complicated. So you could just get by with an IQ of 67 and it'll be fine. Which is ludicrous. It genuinely is.
Yeah, you've seen, sorry to keep talking, with, like, Richard Lynn in another one of his books, where he's discussing so the IQ of hunter-gatherers, and how he's like, oh, well, they're low, and he's taking that at face value. And he's like, well, and they're low because, like, you know, hunting and gathering just isn't that hard. Like, any kind of, any, like, little private schoolboy in England can also go camping and, like, you know, collect berries. And he does bring up, like, an English schoolboy, like, going on a camping trip, and how, like,
did he ever try to, like, survive off the land?
I mean, like, as someone who has lived in the Congo for 2 years in a rainforest, it's pretty hard. You can get lost. There's a lot of, like, if you really have to live on the land, there's a lot of knowledge that you have to have. And it's not, you know, the same kind of knowledge that would get tested in an IQ test. But people speak typically multiple languages as well. And they have, you know, a lot of knowledge that's passed on about the plant life, about the animal life, like survival knowledge. It's not a Boy Scout camp.
Right.
Yeah.
Not at all.
And, like, if you're living in a, you know, among other humans, you know, that you're socializing with other humans, you're talking with other people, you know, and that requires, like, you know, it requires intelligence too. I'm sure even, like, small hunter-gatherer tribes have, like, politics and, you know, they need to have social cohesion and kind of know the ins and outs.
I mean, I bet if we took a bunch of PhDs and, like, left them in the desert to survive, that most of them would fail.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they'll all be backstabbing each other and trying to get first authorship. You've got to, working together requires, you know, a certain amount of, like, you know, tact, which, you know,
well, it's also a different skill set, like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the thing, just the idea that IQ represents, like, what intelligence is in a nutshell is just very silly to me, because there are lots of different things that intelligence can be and lots of different skills that you need in different cultural environments across space and time. So, you know, the idea that this one, like, test can, you know, capture that all is just, and that one score is also, like, a set thing that's genetically determined is just patently ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just all shuffling matrices. That's all. That's what everything comes down to.
Yeah, and it just seems like they're just making up stuff on the spot. Like you were saying, Kevin, like how they are like, oh, you know, this IQ is different for this group of people, even though the same number is, like, it doesn't work the same in, like, different groups, because it's just so, like, obviously nonsense. It just...
Yeah. And very similar. So, you know, almost very similar to the same claims about, like, hunter-gatherers, like, oh, their life is so simple, we don't need intelligence, was essentially packaged into this entire evolutionary argument which I think Lynn came up with, called cold winters theory.
Yes.
which yeah. Africa,
no, that was Rushton, not Lynn.
Oh, it was Rushton? Oh,
it was Rushton's theory, yeah.
We talked about it a bit in our Evo Psych episode a little bit. So.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And I just this idea of I love like Africa, like the second largest continent is this mundane, static environment that doesn't have any pressures for survival or planning.
It's
but
wild.
all of the world outside of it, the fact that you have to store things for the cold or to find shelter, leads to this extreme natural selection. Utter, like completely absurd. Never been an ounce of evidence in support of it.
Yeah, Africa is like the tutorial level in a video game, where it's just like, oh yeah, go that way. But then when you get to like Northern Europe, it's like, wow, this is
it's got a level cap. The tutorial, you can only get up to level 3, but then once you leave.
I mean, I would say, this is obviously not based in any science, but like just thinking as a layperson, it's probably easier to store things in cold weather because you can just like keep them cool and preserved. Whereas if you have to avoid disease and store things in the heat, that seems complicated. But I don't want to do like a reverse cold winters theory.
But that's the thing. You can do like a reverse cold winters theory.
But yeah,
or
you
like
could come up with it.
Hot summer theory.
One thing is,
did it.
Like where did the first civilizations arise?
Right.
They didn't arise in Germany or in England.
But yeah, the logic of cold winters
it's just
theory.
Very silly.
It's fascinating about just how like arbitrary and like post hoc the whole logic is, because it's like, okay, well, I guess breaking down the logic, there's like cold winters, so you have to like plan during the warm season and then store food. And that requires like this extreme amount of natural selection pressure on intelligence, as Kevin said. So you also have like seasons of drought in Africa,
right,
where which also requires planning. There's I always wonder like how is the selection pressures so different in like Northern Europe compared to Africa, and you never really get like a proper answer because of course it's all arbitrary. You could say like the opposite for Africa. Actually, like Africa has like way more extreme like selective pressures for intelligence. While in Europe it's just kind of like half the year you're kind of just taking it easy, right? You've already done all your work, so you can just kind of like sit back and huddle in the cold. Well, so you can make all sorts of just like arguments.
Exactly. You could just make this shit up. Yeah.
So I'm surprised no one hasn't done like a hot summers theory yet and just tried to publish it in like in Mankind Quarterly.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support it, there are several ways you can do that. You can share it online, talk about what you just heard. You can leave a 5-star review to help others find it too. And you can also subscribe via patreon.com/nice mangoes. No E in mangoes. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter before it's completely wrecked, you'll find me at Nice Mangoes. Again, no E in mangoes.